Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Shannon McNeely, Pacific Institute Associate Director, Water and Climate Equity. We have just a few announcements, some housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded. All of you participants are muted. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions for the panelists. You can submit those during the presentation, and then we will have Q&A the last 20 minutes or so. Slides and recording will be made available following the briefing. You'll get an email. There's an email for journalists there if you would like to arrange an interview after this briefing. And if you have any Zoom technical questions or issues, please post that in the chat function. So today we're presenting our third report in the Water, Sanitation, and Climate Change in the U.S. series. The project partners are Pacific Institute and Dig Deep and Center for Water Security and Cooperation, who partner with us on the law and policy reports. The speakers today are in blue, myself, Morgan Shimabuku, and Kim Lemmy. So today what we're going to do is give you a little bit of a background on the series. We are going to talk through the report, talk about the framework, some example strategies, and some real-world stories of change. And then we will briefly talk about next steps and then move into Q&A. So the water access gap in the US was the impetus for this work. We know there's already a water access gap with over 2 million people lacking indoor plumbing and another tens of millions who are in systems with Safe Drinking Water Act violations. In the 2022 report that Dig Deep led called Draining: The Economic Impact of America's Hidden Water Crisis, they determined that for every year we fail to close the water access gap, our country loses $8.58 billion, or about $15,800 per household. This is due to lost productivity, detriments to mental and physical health, lost time from hauling water, and even premature death. So for this series of reports, Water, Sanitation, and Climate Change in the US, we asked the question, how will climate change impact water and sanitation in frontline communities, those impacted first and worst in the United States? And how will this affect those who already don't have access or might backslide and lose access to sufficient, clean, reliable water and sanitation, which are basic human rights? So a little bit about the series. The first part one that we published in 2024, we looked at the impacts of water and sanitation on frontline communities, organized around 6 climate change phenomena: extreme temperatures, flooding, drought, sea level rise, wildfire, and extreme storms. And then in part 2, we examined the laws and policies that address these issues or do not, which is largely the case. So what we will present today is part 3 in the series. We just released this March 18th, where we looked at how equitable, climate resilient water and sanitation is being achieved in frontline communities throughout the US. We did this through a deep review of the literature, government and nonprofit reports, online tools, as well as direct input from practitioners at various online and in-person meetings. And in this research, we found more than 100 strategies across the 7 different categories we covered in the report. And the strategies and approaches we talk about in this report are not meant for a single audience. Rather, they were developed by and for frontline communities, their supporters, community-based organizations, nonprofits, water resource managers, water and wastewater utilities, policy and lawmakers, tribal, federal, state, and local governments. So to guide this particular report, we asked 3 questions. What is equitable, climate resilient water and sanitation? What does it mean? What does it look like? And then what are the characters or attributes of systems that are equitable and climate resilient? And then third, what are practical strategies to achieve it? So the strategies and approaches included here are organized within this 8-part framework that you see in the graphic on the right. And by attribute, we mean an essential or necessary property or characteristic of equitable, climate resilient water and sanitation. So the 8 types include built infrastructure, technology and innovation, natural infrastructure, management and planning, funding and financing, knowledge information, capacity building, and law and policy. So in this report, we covered 7 of the 8 attributes in the framework. The 8th that focuses on law and policy will be published in a future report that we are currently finalizing. So each type in this framework is a main report section. And in those sections, that includes various attributes, strategies, and documented real world examples where the strategies have been applied in frontline communities. And then we also include 3 stories throughout of people and their journeys to secure equitable, climate resilient water and sanitation in their homes and communities. Next slide. So since this is a very long report, we want to talk about the report, but at the same time sort of walk through the organization of the report to help you understand how to navigate it. So each of those main sections is one of the 7 categories, as I mentioned on the previous slide. And then within each category, there's a description of the category. On this slide, it's shown here in green. Each category matches the color of that graphic we showed you. And then each attribute is a subsection and has a list of those strategies and associated document examples where these strategies are being implemented. So the numbers given here match the section number in the report. So this is a built infrastructure section, and it has 4 attributes, and they are 4.1, frontline communities have access to drinking water and sanitation infrastructure and services. 4.2, built infrastructure performs reliably under a range of climate impacts. 4.3, infrastructure siting, design, and construction are inclusive and climate resilient. And 4.4, infrastructure operations and maintenance, O&M, are equitable and climate resilient. So now I'm going to walk you through one of the attributes and the associated strategies and give one example. So the attribute I'm going to talk about is that 4.1 that has to deal with access. It has 2 associated strategies. The first is initiate and support community-led and water and sanitation infrastructure profits with nonprofits, organizations, and other entities who support frontline communities. And then 2 is to create local programs to connect households and communities with water and sanitation systems that are at risk from climate impacts, to connecting them to more climate robust, centralized water and sanitation when possible. So one of the examples that we give for this particular attribute is an example of the second strategy. It's the Connect to Protect program in Miami-Dade County, Florida. So along the Southeast Florida coast, sea level rose 3.9 inches from the year 2000 to 2017, and likely more since 2017. Communities that are reliant on septic systems along the coast are at risk of sea level rise. So in Miami-Dade County, there are about 120,000 septic systems in use, and 9,000 are at risk of failure. And this number is expected to rise with climate change and increased sea level rise to 13,500 by the year 2040. So to overcome this challenge, the county developed this Connect to Protect program to connect at-risk households to more climate robust centralized wastewater services. And this program and others like it can strengthen the climate resilience of frontline communities by offering them a means to connect households to more reliable centralized water systems. So I'm going to give you one more example from the built infrastructure section. I'm not going to go through all of them. We don't have time for that. But this is attribute 4.4, which is focused on O&M. And this this attribute has 5 associated strategies, and those are identify O&M tasks that must be performed or adapted to protect infrastructure from climate impacts, put emergency response plans in place to help operators perform necessary actions during climate emergencies, work with technical assistance providers to perform regular O&M to ensure that infrastructure remains in good condition to withstand climate disruptions, use material training and tools developed from technical assistance providers and other supporters and entities to learn about the tasks needed for improving climate resilience. And lastly, engage directly with frontline communities by prioritizing O&M work that addresses long-standing inequities. So one of the examples that we give for this one is related to the second strategy here, but it also touches on others. And this is the Water Wastewater Agency Response Networks, known as WARN. So there are WARNs located in almost every state, and these are networks of utilities helping utilities. WARN is a mutual aid network for water operators that provide support and aid in disaster situations to ensure ongoing O&M, among other functions. This example just happens to be focused on O&M. So WARN and other similar programs can be incorporated into O&M plans and procedures to help ensure O&M continues even during disruptions, increasing the resilience of water and wastewater systems in frontline communities. So now I'm going to turn it over to Morgan to walk us through some of the other sections. Again, we don't have time to walk through all the sections, so she will be talking through 4 more of the sections. Morgan, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon. Hi, everyone. My name is Morgan Shimabuku, and I'm a Senior Research Specialist at Pacific Institute. So this category, technology and innovation, is focused on using innovative technology to help develop and expand equitable climate resilient water and sanitation. And here, technology is used to describe innovative solutions beyond what is traditionally thought of centralized infrastructure like the pipelines and treatment plants. It can include, but is not limited to, water efficiency, reuse technologies, portable sanitation technologies, agricultural technologies, and more. Some of these technologies do overlap with natural infrastructure strategies. So the first attribute is around sustainably and the first attribute is around sustainable and climate resilience being implemented equitably. The second is addressing access, cost effectiveness, and water savings technologies. The third is for businesses like agriculture or other water-intensive industries to pursue strategies that contribute to the broader climate resilience of a community. And the fourth is ensuring protocols are in place to make sure that new technology is well vetted and safe before it's used. So as one example that we'll look at attribute 5.1. Which includes 4 different strategies. And this is around sustainable and climate resilient water and sanitation technologies being implemented equitably in frontline communities. So the first strategy we identified was engage directly with the people who will be affected by using the technologies to better align the tech with the local values and cultures. The second is around respectful relationships between all groups involved to help co-develop technologies. The third is around knowledge sharing to raise awareness of innovative options, especially for communities with unequal access to information. And the fourth is to use frameworks that center equity in planning and design of technologies. So one example that we point to in the report that demonstrates the first and second strategies is the Indigenous Food, Energy, and Water Security and Water and Sovereignty Program. This is a novel collaboration between the University of Arizona and DNA College that use the culture and values of the community to guide the design of a water filtration system that helps households that don't have running water in their homes to have safe, clean water. The project was designed in response to the needs of the households on the Navajo Nation that don't have running water and are therefore required to collect water, sometimes from unregulated sources that can be unsafe. And droughts are only making water access more challenging in this region and increasing the concentration of contaminants in some of the sources that people rely on. The systems are solar powered and mobile and can clean up to 1,500 gallons of water per day for up to 30 households. And this partnership, the resulting technology, both strengthen the climate resilience of Navajo Nation households by providing clean water even during climate disruptions. Another attribute that we wanted to highlight is the second attribute around frontline communities have access to cost-effective and water-saving technologies. And for this, we discussed 3 strategies. First is to develop water efficiency programs specifically for low-income households so they also can benefit. The second, organizations delivering water efficiency technology should partner with CBOs, with community-based organizations, to help build trust and enhance uptake of the technologies. And third, we see how in some places people have worked to leverage corporate investments to implement water and cost-saving technologies, such as in affordable housing complexes. So an example that we point to in the report is from the city of Tucson. The city of Tucson has developed low-income conservation programs which address the first and second strategies. The city is almost entirely dependent on the Colorado River for water supply, and drought is compromising their supplies. The impacts of these droughts directly affect frontline communities in the city first and worse. Notably, Tucson has one of the highest poverty rates among Western U.S. metropolitan areas. To address drought impacts and reduce water and energy bills for low-income communities in the city, Tucson revamped several more traditional water efficiency programs to better serve low-income residents and ensure they can also access the water and cost-saving technologies like high-efficiency toilets, clothes washers, and rainwater harvesting equipment at free or greatly reduced costs. For example, instead of a rebate program, they offer rainwater harvesting grants and loans through a partnership with a local community-based organization that has long-standing connections with marginalized and other low-income communities in the city. This offers a trusted bridge between the city and target participants. Next slide. So this next category, natural infrastructure. This category of attributes is around what we have called natural infrastructure, which we define as an umbrella term that includes nature-based solutions and green infrastructure approaches. Some examples of nature-based solutions include wetlands to help control water pollution and mitigate flooding, natural vegetation management and restoration to reduce the impacts of floods and droughts, or sand dune restoration to protect land from stormwater surges. Green infrastructure can be urban ecosystem elements like bioswales, green roofs, and rain gardens that help provide a variety of benefits to water quality, quantity, biodiversity, air quality, urban heat, recreation, and beautification. And this category has 4 attributes. The first is about removing constraints, legal, regulatory, financial, etc., so that these strategies can be pursued. The second is about centering frontline communities in natural infrastructure planning. The third is about addressing displacement risks. And the fourth is about improving our valuation of natural infrastructure benefits and trade-offs for the decision-making processes. For this category, we'll talk through one of the attributes, 6.1, removing constraints. For this attribute, we discuss 4 strategies. First is about integrating natural infrastructure management into existing knowledge and information exchanges, planning, and across departments, sectors, and jurisdictions. Second is about implementing policies to help overcome constraints to natural infrastructure implementation. Third is about forming strong partnerships and interdisciplinary groups to address conflicts over natural infrastructure and build support and consensus. And the fourth is about using innovative and diverse funding for natural infrastructure. An example we point to in the report of the first strategy is the Blue River Action Plan, which is an integrated management plan to support water quality improvement through natural infrastructure strategies on the Blue River, which crosses 5 counties and 21 cities in the Kansas City area of Missouri. This action plan helps all the relevant jurisdictions to sustain planning efforts and coordinate on watershed protection, habitat restoration, enhanced flood control, and improved public recreation projects. To ensure all voices are part of the planning process, a local NGO, the Heartland Conservation Alliance, helps to bring in engagement with community members. The next section, section 7, is management and planning. The management and planning category describes how equity is centered in how environmental protection, community input, financial sustainability, climate impacts and risks, and multi-sector coordination and monitoring and evaluation is incorporated into planning and management of water and sanitation access. This section has 6 attributes. The first is focused on including source water protection in water sanitation and climate plans. The second is equitable involvement and empowerment of frontline communities in the management and planning process. The third is for water managers and utilities to do proactive long-term planning to incorporate climate change. The fourth is the planning to prepare water and sanitation systems for climate disasters. The fifth is around coordination across sectors. And the sixth is about monitoring and evaluating to make sure that initiatives intended to advance equitable, climate resilient water and sanitation are successfully meeting their goals. For this category, we'll provide an example of the fourth attribute on preparing water and sanitation systems for climate disasters and the inequitable impacts to frontline communities. For this attribute, we identified 5 strategies. The first is to develop emergency response plans for equitable response to climate disruptions. The second is to include community input in climate risk assessments. The third is to create redundancy and resilience by having more than one water source. The fourth is to have water and sanitation system staff participate in trainings and workshops on equity and climate resilience. And the fifth is to integrate climate resilience hubs into planning and management to strengthen resilience and social equity after climate disasters. An example of the second strategy is a flood risk assessment conducted by the Philadelphia Water Department with academic partners. The assessment focused on a watershed that is prone to flooding from increased precipitation and sea level rise, and includes the low-lying, predominantly Black neighborhood of Eastwick. In the development of flood models, the project included community input, especially in the development of the potential adaptation strategies. A local community-based organization proposed a relocation plan for some of the most at-risk residents in Eastwick. And this effort helped to empower community members to participate in the flood risk mitigation and climate disruption planning, and resulted in more equitable climate resilient strategies to reduce flood risk for this frontline community. The next section is funding and financing. So this category on funding and financing has 5 attributes that are needed for adequate, sustainable, equitable funding and financing and disaster insurance. The first attribute is for funding and financing for the built infrastructure water and sanitation projects. The second attribute is for climate resilient operations and maintenance to be funded in frontline communities. The third is funding and financing for disaster preparation, mitigation, and response, including insurance. The fourth is funding and financing for alternative approaches such as water efficiency, reuse, nature-based solutions, and green infrastructure. And the fifth is focused on ensuring frontline communities can afford climate resilient water and sanitation in their homes. So for this, we'll give an example of the fourth attribute. Here we offer 4 strategies. The first strategy is to increase funding available for alternative approaches. The second is to ensure that funding and financing for alternative approaches is accessible to frontline communities. The third is to enact policies that ensure frontline communities receive an equitable amount of the benefits from the funded projects. And the fourth is to offer programs that incentivize or pay for water efficiency upgrades in households and frontline communities. So one example in the report of the first strategy is North Carolina's Resilient Coastal Communities Program, which is a funding program designed to help communities prepare for climate change impacts. The program proposes strategies, including nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, and stormwater management to increase climate resilience and reduce risk as climate-related impacts become more severe, especially for frontline communities. In New Bern, North Carolina, the Duffy Field Community Resilience Improvement, Rose Street Basin and Restoration and Enhancement Project received about $175,000 in a grant through this program to reduce community vulnerability to climate impact from flooding. Once complete, the project will include a swale or swales and forested wetlands to help capture rainwater, treat and store stormwater, and buffer high tide events, helping to mitigate flood impacts in the community. One note on this section, this report does include a lot of examples of federal funding programs. As much of the research we conducted was in 2024, but in January 2025, things have changed, so we did try to reflect that the best we could in the final preparations of the report. So now I am going to transition to Kim Lemmy. And for the sake of time, we're not going to go through the last two sections on knowledge and information and capacity building, but hopefully you can check out the report and learn more about what's in those on your own time. So passing this on to Kim, who's going to talk about the Dig Deep stories that are included in the report that serve to illustrate on a personal level how creating access to water and sanitation in frontline communities can help achieve equitable climate resilience. Go ahead, Kim.
Thanks, Morgan, and thanks, Shannon. I am Kimberly Lemmy. I lead the research and innovation function at Dig Deep. We are a human rights-based organization focused on closing the water access gap here in the United States. So interspersed in this long report that is so wonderful and comprehensive, and I just appreciate all the work that went into it by everyone. You'll find some stories that are highlighting Dig Deep clients that help to illustrate what all this research is telling us and helps to put a face to a story or to really illustrate what it looks like on the ground and what the impact of climate change is when it's a lived experience. So story number one, section in the end of section 5, as it relates to technology and innovation, let's journey to the Navajo Nation, which straddles a little bit of Utah and New Mexico and a bit of Arizona. And Herbert's story is a very common one. As Morgan shared a bit about in her earlier slides, 30% of households on the Navajo Nation lack running water. And what that means is residents experience a daily struggle to access it. They have to drive a long distance, they have to buy a lot of bottled water. It looks different for different homes, but it is definitely something that those of us with a pipe coming into our home take for granted. These challenges in and of themselves are really difficult, and when they're sitting within a 25-year mega drought in the southwest of the US, they're made even harder. And I think as we think through this and as these mega droughts get longer and as flooding becomes more frequent and all of these impacts of a changing climate show us, is it becomes much more acute and felt more closely by these households who are lacking access. So in partnership with community on the ground, Dig Deep helped Herbert and his family to install a solar powered home water system. And essentially what you're seeing here in this picture is a 1,200 gallon cistern that is buried under the ground, and then water is piped into the household, providing them with what we all take for granted regularly. And that water, or that cistern, obviously needs to be refilled. But what it does is it allows Herbert and hundreds of families like him, like his, to really have a more reliable source of water. And if the power goes out or if the grid goes down because it's too hot, there are things like solar powered systems that allow that consistency and access of service. So health is improved, dignity is improved, and just the reliability and one less major worry on the minds of many of these families. The second story is in section 8, and as it relates to funding and financing, it really highlights the impacts of climate change. Many households, I want to say I'm not even going to say the number because I might get it wrong, but there's a huge percentage of households across this country that rely on private wells. And in a place like Central Appalachia, where Dig Deep has some work, where flooding is happening more regularly, we've seen it already this year, 1,000-year flooding happening for the third time in 5 years. The math doesn't work very well there. And so private wells are harder to maintain, more expensive to maintain, and many of these rural households just can't continue to keep their wells clean and safe. And so Glenda's story really helps us to see that just connecting to a pipe that is at the end of her driveway, for example, when her well became unreliable, we worked with her and others in her community to connect her to the municipal system and to the utility. To ensure that that service is an ongoing thing and she doesn't need to be worried about maintaining and managing and testing the water that's coming out of a private well. That's not to say that private wells are bad. They're certainly a very important resource for many families across the country. And oftentimes the financial implications of relying on a private well become out of reach for households. And so with flooding, with droughts, those are impacts on things like private wells. And so similar to the story from the Navajo Nation, Glenda in Central Appalachia was able to connect to that municipality and to become a paying customer of the municipal water line, and able to rely on and worry one less thing to worry about. And as we saw again earlier in the year, those floods in that region are happening more regularly and more frequently. The next story takes us to the Texas-Mexico border in areas that are called the colonias, which are neighborhoods that often sit in unincorporated parts of a county. And often we call them donut holes, but often really what it is they're situated in between the boundaries of one utility and another utility. And so there's really no one to go knocking on the door to ask for support or help. And so capacity building section is really interesting. And when we began our work in the colonias, we could see that there were decades of advocacy efforts underway to no avail. These households, these plots of land are developed without basic utilities and basic infrastructure. And Bertha and her family are one of hundreds across this Texas-Mexico border where they're stuck and they're kind of advocating for themselves and struggling to make any real progress. One of the colonias where we've helped connect to a water system was waiting for 30 years. And that's too long. I think everyone would agree. Oftentimes these colonias are less than a mile from an existing main line, and it's just that connection that's needed to get that community running water consistently, safely, on a regular basis. And so Dig Deep partnered with the community, helped to further the advocacy that was already well underway. We helped to connect and negotiate with the existing utilities in a way that allowed them to kind of bring them into the fold of an existing municipality. And we have hundreds of stories like this across the country, not just where Dig Deep works, but oftentimes it's just a little bit of an extra support that a community needs because they're being directly impacted disproportionately by climate changes, by lacking access to water. And so I really invite you, as you go through the report, to spend some time with these stories because they're not uncommon. They represent millions of people across the country. And I love how it complements the research and brings the research to life. And with that, I think I'm handing it back to Shannon for Q&A.
Almost. Thanks, Kim, and thanks, Morgan. So just a quick note on the next step for this work. We are, as I mentioned earlier, writing a separate report on the law and policies strategies the 8th category of our framework. We're aiming to publish that sometime this summer. And it's not on this slide, but we also are going to write a series summary, kind of summing up all of the reports in the series. And then we have a rural water project with Rural Water Partners, and we are also in the process of finishing the rural version of this strategies report. So we hope to publish that in June. And with that, I want to thank everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Next slide, please. Also want to thank our funders of this work, BHP Foundation and Liquid IV, who is funding the law and policy work, and everyone who contributed in whatever way to this report, our Pacific Institute communications team for helping us publish and promote this work and for coordinating this webinar. And our board. We have a wonderful board for Pacific Institute, and they have been super supportive of our work. So we're really happy about that. So with that, we can answer any questions now, and our colleague Rachel will be moderating the Q&A segment. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone. We're now in the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A function, not the chat function, but the Q&A function, which should be on the bottom of your panel. So I'll stop sharing my screen now so I can jump in and see questions as they come in. Just give me one moment here. So we have a question, which strategies in the report do you think are currently the most underappreciated or deserve to get more attention?
I can answer that, and then I will turn it over to Morgan and Kim if they'd like to give an answer as well. One major one I think a lot of people in this field know about already is there's a real need for investing in climate resilient operations and maintenance. A lot of grants will only fund infrastructure upgrades, but they often don't fund O&M, but this is foundational to climate resilience. So proactively identifying O&M tasks tied to climate risks like wildfire or extreme heat, training operators, supporting emergency protocols can prevent service disruptions and long-term infrastructure damage. Yet this funding, as I mentioned, is often overlooked or not included. So that's one of the areas that we feel is really important and needs more focus and funding. Morgan, did you want to give another answer?
Sure, I'll just answer one quickly. Is we also it seems from our research found that improving financial resilience of small systems through planning and rate setting processes. So climate change can really destabilize utility finances, but asset management and demand forecasting and equitable rate structures that do take climate change into consideration are often underutilized, especially in capacity limited water and wastewater utility situations. So we do outline some practices in section 7.3 that are critical that can help frontline communities be more resilient by more financial planning and long-term planning that incorporates climate change especially for small systems. It also really helps to prevent sort of affordability crises and that are caused by climate disruptions or for other reasons. So, Kim, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I plus one to all of those, and would only add that I think the awareness and kind of the making the link for the average person in this country that frontline communities are contributing the least most often and feeling the effects the most, and making that connection and ensuring that all of these attributes and sections that are really nicely laid out in the report are reason we're doing this, and the reason the research points to it, is because these are the communities that are feeling it first and worst. and need the most support to either get back online or even just get access in the first place. And so I think that that awareness of that link between how place-based much of these impacts are felt, and that those places tend to be places we might see in a fleeting news cycle, but then forget about quickly again. And raising that awareness is an important point too.
Thank you for those thoughtful answers. The next question that came up is, does the report cover water access issues as well?
I already answered that in the Q&A function, and I said, yes, we talk about water access pretty much throughout the whole report.
Yeah.
So the next question is, with climate change come novel contaminants, industrial chemicals, such as PFAS, under which section does water quality testing and monitoring covered?
So that's another one that shows up in different parts of the report. So there's one example in the technology and information innovation section about industrial chemicals. In the management and planning, there are a couple different examples about well testing and monitoring. I think, you know, a lot of the natural infrastructure also, of course, addresses water quality issues. So there's several in there, I think, that touch on that. And then funding and financing has some strategies related to this as well. So again, I think you can do a word search of the report and find those.
Thank you, Shannon. Our next question starts with, thank you for a great webinar. 2 questions. The first is, what strategies in the financing section were updated or will need to be updated in response to our current federal disinvestment in many climate EJ related work? And 2, are there examples of strategies outside of the US?
Yeah, and I'll jump in there. There were definitely, like I noted, a lot of federal funding strategies that we point to in the report. And while some have been changed, there's also some that do still exist. But it also just shows with these changes the importance that other sources like private donors and foundations, state funding and local funding are going to be that much more important. And we do point to examples of all of those in the report as well. So not just federal funding programs. And just it you know, is important to note that when these infrastructure programs or other climate resilient and adaptation programs lose funding, communities do face greater challenges in maintaining their clean and reliable water systems. So it will be critical to continue to support that through all different channels, not just the federal government. I guess I'll just offer one example. So in Texas, the Water Development Board administers a lot of different funding programs that are state level funds for improving resiliency of water and wastewater infrastructure. One way they've raised money is through something called the Texas Infrastructure Resiliency Fund, which has contributed to recovery efforts from Hurricane Harvey, as well as funding for flood planning, protection, mitigation, and other adaptation projects for water and wastewater systems. So that's just one example, and there are others in the report. And then briefly, we actually intentionally work to not put in strategies from outside the US, although there might be a handful. There are a handful here and there, but in general, we really worked hard to find US-based strategies as the context in this country has some unique aspects. And that's not to say there aren't a lot of lessons that we could learn from. It was just our goal was to really highlight what's already happening in this country.
So we do have a couple examples. I think Rachel was going to give one or two, but also backing up to what needed to change in the financing section. We did the bulk of this research and writing in 2024, and we were actually going to producing the publication when January happened in 2025. So we actually pulled it from publication and tried to kind of update things as best we could, where we did talk about federal funding sources that became uncertain, or federal resources online that were no longer available. But there, as we also caveat in the report, there could be others that disappear in the future. But hopefully the review of federal funding programs will live for posterity, and if they disappear for a while, hopefully they'll be picked back up in the future. But Rachel, did you want to give a non-US example or two?
Sure, yeah. So the natural infrastructure section was one that did pull in a few examples from outside of the US. This is in part because other parts of the world put more emphasis on these solutions. We have them here as well, or these strategies, but there were some things that some of the attributes that we found that had really great illustrative examples, not from the US, but from elsewhere. And we, in some of these cases, chose to use these examples, and we felt they were illustrative of things that could also be tailored to a local US context. So there are a few examples in that section and sprinkled throughout the report. One in particular is a restoration of the Isar River around Munich, Germany, and the nature-based solutions or strategies to get the river back to its kind of original functioning, and through nature-based processes to reduce flooding impacts. So there are a few of these examples outside of the US that we do feature in the report. I'll move on to our next question, which is, as you're writing this series, is there any area you wish you had explored more or are interested in exploring in the future?
Yeah, I can answer that one. So at the very end of the report, in the conclusion section, we have gaps identified for information deficits, areas for future research, some of which we hope to take on ourselves, some of which we hope others will take on. But I'll just give you a couple of examples that were in there. So one is how are technologies for commercial, agriculture, and industrial water users affecting climate resilience and equity for frontline communities? And also guidance is needed for equitable implementation of climate resilience, water and sanitation technologies in these sectors, and sort of identifying what they are and then evaluating their effectiveness, I think are areas of interest. And then another one is the intersection of utility financial capability, household affordability, and climate resilience. There's an especially significant dearth of guidance relevant for small underserved utilities and communities on this topic. And another one that we, discovered is really underdeveloped. I think someone mentioned this already, is the natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions in frontline communities. So we had kind of a hard time finding examples, even harder in rural areas. We're not saying they don't exist, but just finding anything documented was extremely difficult. And then also, evaluating feasibility of any of those natural infrastructure solutions in frontline communities, and effectiveness are understudied areas in the US, especially.
Great, thank you.
But there's more, so please look at the report.
So next question is, were there any overarching lessons, takeaways, or key themes that stood out about how frontline communities can build climate resilient water and sanitation systems?
Yeah, we kind of already answered that question. I guess we can give a couple of other examples. One is, minimizing unintended harms from climate resilient strategies. So You know, these approaches, while these approaches can significantly improve water and sanitation access for frontline communities, they can also carry unintended risks if not carefully designed and implemented. So one example is in section 6 in the natural infrastructure section that outlines strategies to reduce displacement risks tied to natural infrastructure projects. And then another example in section 5 in technology and innovation offers safeguards to ensure new water and sanitation technologies are tested, safe, and beneficial for frontline communities. So it's really important to assess and address potential trade-offs early to prevent additional burdens on those already impacted. And like I just mentioned, feasibility both from and sustainability both from a financial perspective as well as a you know, cultural and context specific vantage point. So does anyone else want to give any other examples or answers to that?
Go for it, Kim. We've been talking a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Please.
I was just gonna to chime in and say, really double down on what Shannon mentioned in terms of making sure that the right voices are at the table. I think with the recent flooding we saw in West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, and that we continue to see, it feels like month after month, that the solutions are often best known by those who are living the experience and who have the lived experience about what the short-term immediate response and solution is, and making sure that we don't just focus on bringing in experts from the outside who just know, but making sure that there's that inclusive piece that ensures that the context is best understood by those who have lived it for years. And so I think that's a piece that is really important to continue focusing on as we continue to live through the changes.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is, how will we know when we've achieved truly equitable, climate resilient water and sanitation?
I can take that one. So couple things. One is the reason that we structured this around, you know, these attributes is that's kind of what those attributes are supposed to be, the function they're supposed to be serving. So what are the attributes of a system that has, you know, equitable, climate resilient built infrastructure and so on. But a couple, you know, sort of more concrete examples, not totally. I mean, I don't have like, you know, numbers to cite or anything like that, but, you know, since we do focus the report a lot on the water access gap, both closing the water access gap as well as helping to prevent backsliding of communities who might lose access or have, you know, diminished access or water quality. And then also when climate disruptions are minimized. So, you know, we know that climate change is going to continue for decades into the future, if not longer. We know that climate change is actually accelerating at a very fast pace. And the number of climate disasters is rising and rising. You know, we talk about the billion-dollar disasters that are tracked, for example. So, you know, helping communities make themselves more climate proof and be able to withstand and bounce back from these types of climate disruptions is another sort of broad indicator of, you know, how we know when it's equitable and climate resilient.
Thank you so much, Shannon. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box, but I think at this point we can open it up so participants can raise their hands and then unmute yourselves. I think we can try this out. We just have time for another question or two, if anyone has another. I think I just accidentally raised my own hand. But feel free to add questions to the Q&A box as well if you have any other questions come to mind. And as a reminder, if you think of any questions later, I'll provide a link in the chat so you can reach out to us if things come up related to this report that you think of later. Feel free to reach out to us. So I dropped that in the chat. So feel free to jump in and ask any questions. And I just dropped that, or yeah, our email's just been dropped in the chat. So if any other questions come up, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd love to keep the conversation going.
Especially if you know of any rural examples that, you know, we might not have been able to find. As I mentioned, we are in the process of finishing the rural strategies report, which is basically going to look almost identical to this report, but just pulling out the rural examples and finding other ones, resources and case examples that are specific to rural context. So if anyone has any interesting examples and can point us to, you know, anything documented, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Shannon.
Are you looking for examples? I'm sorry, it's not a question I have. It's an observation.
What's the question?
It's not a question, it's an observation.
If we're looking for examples?
I have an example of a technology that should work for rural areas.
Oh, that'd be great. If you could
Okay.
send that to the email in the chat.
I
We would
did
love to
enter
read
this
about
in
it.
the chat. I did enter this in the chat towards the beginning, but
Okay.
here in Western New York, in Alfred, New York, around the incomparable Ceramic College at Alfred University, we have developed water filters of packed particle beds that can be large scale, point of use if necessary, and could even replace slow sand treatment in municipal water treatment with no subsequent need of reverse osmosis or ultraviolet. It should support nature-based alternatives in that there are no chemicals, there's no gadgetry, and it does no harm to the environment.
That's great. Can't wait to read more about it. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll record and review the whole chat. Well, looks like we're coming to the top of the hour. So
I was just gonna respond to Aaron put a thing in the chat about connecting to territories. So yes, that would be great. If you want to send an email to that wce@pacins.org, that will we can get back to you and talk about any connections. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you all so much for attending and for your thoughtful questions. Thanks to all of our wonderful panelists. Thanks to our sponsors. As a heads up, you will receive a follow-up email with a recording available of this presentation, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions following this. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.